hot pressed, cold pressed, rough. What is the deal with all these different surface textures? Let's talk watercolor paper and paint some mini florals. Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back. My name is Shayda and today I'm in my studio kind of doing a little reorganizing around here, but I feel like painting, so we're gonna sit down, paint some watercolor florals on ripped paper, and I want to use it as an excuse to discuss the different surface types, watercolor paper surfaces. So let's get into it. If you find this content helpful, support this channel by hitting the subscribe button now. Watercolor paper comes in 3 different surface texture types: hot pressed, cold pressed, and rough. And that's exactly what we're going to discuss and compare in this video. So, starting with cold pressed. Cold pressed is what I call the Goldilocks. It's not too rough and toothy, and it's not too smooth. A lot of watercolor artists like it because you can put a large wash on it, but you can also use it for fine detail. Hot pressed paper, on the other hand, is very, very smooth with little tooth and texture, and paint tends to dry very quickly on it. And then rough paper is just what it sounds like, and it has a lot of tooth and texture, and it really absorbs the paint very well. You can really layer a lot on rough, but it's not as good for fine detail. Whereas hot pressed, because it's so smooth, it's wonderful for fine detail, but if you layer too much on it, the paper cannot take on all that paint. That's why a lot of artists reach for cold pressed. It's kind of the perfect one right in between, but today we're going to compare all 3. Before we begin painting and looking at paper texture, let's talk about the supplies that I'm using. I have my Muñoz 48 pan watercolor set. This is a really good quality of paint for the price. It's linked in the description. Got a couple glasses of clean water. I have some new synthetic brushes. These are from Princeton. I have a couple round brushes, or I sometimes call them pointed round, but round and pointed round, same difference. I have some smaller ones, like a number 2 and 4, and then a larger number 8. So it's nice to have a range of those depending on what you're doing. If you're doing some really tiny stuff or some larger leaves and petals, you can kind of, switch up your brush and reach for the tool that's right for the process. We're also going to talk a little bit of mixing color, just because I know a lot of you really like to see the color mixing. So let's begin with some of my favorite greens. I love mixing olive green or olive brown with a little bit of deep phthalo green. And I also like to mix deep phthalo green, which is the one on the right-hand side, with a little bit of purple or blue to really darken it, and it makes quite a rich color. So that's what you see me mixing up here: olive green and deep phthalo green, and then deep phthalo green and a little bit of dark purple, or you could use like a navy blue. I'm going to rinse my brush, and then I want to grab some of this yellow ochre. This is sort of the yellow color that I always reach for, just because it's such a beautiful golden muted yellow. It's not like a lemony yellow, so I really like this. I'm just putting lots of water, so I've got a nice watery brush, and I scrub at the cake of paint, and then I'm going to mix in some white. So scrubbing at the white cake with a wet brush, and then bringing the pigment over to the palette, and on the palette is where I can mix my perfect blend of color. We'll begin our discussion of surface texture types with hot pressed paper. So if you remember, hot pressed is very, very smooth on the surface, and it's not quite as dense and toothy as rough and cold pressed paper. That means it doesn't absorb quite as much water. So it's not great for doing a lot of layers. It also means that paint tends to dry very quickly, so it can be good for large washes. And because it's so smooth, it's great for doing fine detail. And that's what you see me doing here, is all these tiny little flowers where each petal is sort of its own thing. So I'm painting these tiny flowers one petal at a time in little clusters of 4s and 5s, or even just little V shapes and heart shapes. This is such a fun way to paint a delicate flower. And that's that's something we're also going to talk about in this video. We're talking paper texture, but we're also painting mini flowers, and mini flowers are a great way to practice with different paper types. They're a great way to practice your brush strokes, and frankly, they're just really easy to be successful with. When you're painting small, it's hard to mess up. You can do everything really tiny and it looks so detailed, but it's not difficult. You just want to use a small brush and take your time. And with hot press paper, with that beautiful smooth texture, we can paint this really detailed, tiny little flower, and you can really see what this paper is good for. We're not going to do a lot of layering. We'll do some layering, but not a ton. What we're going to do with this flower is just work with these tiny, fine little details, and that's what that hot press paper is great for. So you can see me here using my number 2 round brush, and I'm just painting these really delicate little stems and branches. I use the very tip of the round brush for that, and then I add just a little bit of extra pressure to make these organic and very natural leaf shapes. So you just let that brush kind of hit the page with a little more pressure. That's how we're creating our leaves and petals. And then I said we're not going to do a lot of layering, but we want to do a little bit. So what I've done here is added a little bit of brown to my yellow ochre just to darken it slightly, and I can add just a little bit of spotting or some lines near the center of each flower, and that is going to make them really jump off the page, and it adds that extra bit of depth and dimension, and it just makes a nicer contrast, makes the whole thing more interesting and more detailed. And then I'm using a dark brown, and you can see I just used the tip of my paintbrush to do some little dots, and that makes the stamen at the center of the flower, and that completes my first mini floral on hot press paper. If you feel like you need a few more little leaves and branches anywhere, you can of course add those, but this is our first example complete, and I think you can really see the benefits of that very smooth hot pressed watercolor paper. So just a quick recap. Hot pressed paper is incredibly smooth. It has very little surface tooth and texture, and it's not quite as dense. It doesn't absorb as much water as cold pressed and rough. The smooth surface makes it great for detail work. I often reach for it when I'm painting white flowers because I'm doing these tiny little gray lines, but the paint does dry a lot faster, so keep that in mind. And don't reach for it if you know you're going to be doing a lot of layers. Next, we're going to swing the pendulum the other way and discuss rough watercolor paper. Just what it sounds like. It's incredibly toothy and textured, and I like to reach for it when I can incorporate the texture of the paper into the painting. So something like a little hydrangea, which is what we're going to paint now, I want to use the paper texture to actually become part of that flower. So as I was saying before, mini florals are a lot of fun to paint because they're simple. We don't need to capture any large detail. We're just kind of abstracting the flower because it's so tiny. So here I'm going to use the paper texture to my advantage to create the look of lots and lots of petals. So this rough paper becomes the little hydrangea petals, and let me pick up a little bit of green paint. As I go, I'm going to do these big, round, messy areas that I would call the flower. And then while they're still wet, and remember the paint stays wet longer on the rough paper, we're going to also add in some green leaves. And that way we get a beautiful blending between the purple and blue and the green. So that's another nice thing about rough paper. That paint is not going to dry as quickly. And that's because the fibers are farther apart. The water and pigment can really seep in and kind of stay wet, unlike the hot press where it was drying very quickly on the surface. So we're using all that texture to our advantage, making this kind of messy area of blue and purple, and all those blues and purples are blending. Then our little tiny green leaves, that's blending with the blue and purple. And we're just, creating the look of these hydrangeas without actually doing a lot of detail. And it's not impossible to do, fine work on rough paper. Here you can see me taking my pointed round brush, and I'm just using the very tip of that brush to do these little brown branches and stems, you know, kind of joining everything together. I never want those stems to be too straight or too smooth. I want them to be a little messy. And then I'm adding some more green leaves in there as well. And you always want to tuck a few little green shapes in behind to make it look like there's a little leaf poking out there. And that's just going to give the whole plant a more organic, natural look. I also reached for a little bit of darker green, and I'm able to layer that darker green on top of those leaves as they dry, and then I'm layering some darker purple and blue on top of the floral area. You want to go quite a bit darker, just do a little bit of stippling and spotting, and that is really going to make our hydrangea look like there are tons and tons of tiny little blossoms, and all you had to do was a little bit of dotting with the end of your brush. If you need a little extra guidance, I've released a watercolor worksheet specifically about this hydrangea. A watercolor worksheet means you really can see every step that I've done, and when you support me on Patreon, you get bonus content and you support this channel. Check it out after the video. To quickly recap, rough paper has an incredible amount of surface texture. It can absorb a lot of water, and the paint and pigment will stay wet a bit longer, especially a lot longer than hot pressed paper. Use it if you're doing a lot of layering, and definitely use it if you feel that you can incorporate the texture into the painting. Maybe you're painting a landscape and you're really going to use that texture to make all those tiny little trees or something like that. Or just use it if you like a lot of surface texture. Some people like that, some people find it annoying. You need to try it out and figure out what's right for you. Cold pressed paper, our Goldilocks, not too rough and not too smooth. The paint stays wet on the paper, it absorbs lots of water, but it's also not so rough that fine details become a little bit difficult, or actually might even get lost in the paper texture. So this is kind of the go-to for a lot of artists, and it's probably, I think, the easiest to find when you go into an art store. I'm going to use it to do some roses that need a little bit of fine detail, but that also need the water to stay wet on that page for a moment. So you see me starting with a very light pink and doing this messy broken spiral. Well, I need those roses to stay wet because what I'm going to do is paint a couple of them. And you see me doing that here, doing a couple different sizes of roses and a little cluster of 3. And then I'm going to reach for a darker pink. And because the paint is still wet, I'm able to do some dotting at the center of each flower and make it look like it's that tight clustered little rosebud. And because the paint was still wet, I get that beautiful blending of dark and light pink. Now, because the paper is not too textured, I can paint some nice fine stems and branches, and I did that with a little bit of brown. And then I'm reaching for a very natural sort of olive green, and we're just going to paint some tiny little leaves. And I'm doing that just the same way I did with the first flower. I just kind of add a little bit of extra pressure to the brush and allow those natural organic leaf shapes to emerge. So you use the tip of that round brush for the tiny branches and stems, and then just let it hit the page a little more and allow those natural leaf shapes to become part of your painting. As the roses dry, you can always go back with that dark pink and add more detail. Cold pressed paper is good for small details as well. And that is our rose, our little mini rose, complete. To recap, cold pressed paper is probably the most popular among most artists. It's not too rough and not too smooth. The paint stays wet long enough for you to do some beautiful wet into wet work and layer your colors. It absorbs paint beautifully, so you can do multiple layers really easily. And there's enough texture there that if you wanted to work with the texture of the paper and incorporate that in as part of your painting, you certainly can, but it's also smooth enough that you can easily do fine detail work. So that's it. That is my quick discussion of the watercolor paper surface texture types. Remember, there's still different weights, but those are the 3 surface textures, and those are the papers that you can choose from. So think about it, try them all, and decide which is the best for the particular piece of art that you're working on. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.